Well, if I think back to the time that I was, say, 20, I was born in 1943, so that would be 1963. And I think Europe meant nothing to me whatsoever at that time, at any rate, modern Europe. I had just gone to university a year earlier, 1963 in Britain, the year of the Beatles, I think. Manchester United had a very good team. Modern Europe meant nothing to me. As a student, I was very interested in reading medieval history. So Europe meant to me really Christian Europe of the medieval era, and then the breakdown of Catholic Europe with the division of Europe in the Reformation period, which is a period we'd done at school. Just to add on to that, neither at school nor at university did I do any European history after 1914. So consequently, the whole of the 20th century practically didn't figure in this. And for me then, coming from a working class milieu in Oldham, near Manchester, at that time, we had no opportunity to go to Europe. Europe didn't mean anything. The European Economic Community was, I don't know if I was aware of the name even at that time, I can't think so. I went to France for the first time I'd been outside Britain at the age of 17. My wife was 28 when she went abroad for the first time. My parents were in their 50s when they went. So generationally and in class terms, Europe was something that didn't figure in our everyday lives. And when I went there, I went to France, not to Europe. And then later on in the 1970s, I started going to Germany. And it was to Germany I was going to, not really specifically to Europe. But there you ask about my formative experiences of Europe then. They came via Germany and via my German friends who had a completely different perspective on Europe than I did. And through them, I gradually came to see Europe in a quite different way. But my absolute formative experience, I think, of Europe, as opposed to Germany and bits of Europe, was actually in 1989, when I happened to be in Berlin, and the year the wall came down, 89-90, and that was the year when Europe started to come together, and where it made then sense to think of Europe as opposed to the different countries of Europe. Of course, I remember when Britain joined the European Economic Communities, it was in 1973. I was in favour of us joining, but I was in favour of us joining because of economic reasons. Britain was going through a bad time. The economy was in a mess in Britain, and I thought, like many people did, that it would be economically advantageous for us to be part of the European Economic Community. So it was for me, as for many British people at the time, I think, a sort of transaction. It was better that we were in economically than that we were out, but I didn't have any emotional or idealistic feelings about Europe. In contrast to my German friends, which is why I said that they were influential in a way, because when I visited them and so on, I had a completely different impression of Europe. For them, Europe had been the saviour of peace after the Second World War. They're older than me, and they were very influenced by the fact that the Franco-German friendship was the basis of European integration, and this had solidified peace and democracy in Europe after 1945. Of course, coming from Britain, from England in particular, we had democracy already. It had been unbroken by the war. We had our own story about the war, which was completely different to the German story about the war. Europe had been, my grandfather had been in the First World War. Apart from that, my father was in the Second World War. But Europe didn't mean anything to us. It was just, well, we fought 2 world wars, but we fought them against Germany, not against Europe. And so this idealism of a Europe that had been saved by integration, that didn't really figure in our consciousness at all, I think. Certainly not in mine. And it only gradually became significant after the end of the communists, end of communism, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Iron Curtain, and then the gradual steps after the Maastricht Treaty then to integrate Europe more widely. So I think it's a learning process rather than some sort of emotional commitment to Europe right at the beginning. I think what I described as my own views about Britain were not dissimilar to the views of other people from similar sort of background to mine. I had the good fortune to go on to a grammar school and then to university, and so despite coming from this milieu, I moved away from it in certain senses intellectually. If I'd have not had this trajectory, I think I would have still been in the same group of people who then think differently about Europe to this very day and are not very attracted to Europe. So was that a dominant narrative in this country? I think it probably was. And look back at people in my area, of course, for people who were already in intellectual circles and so on at that time, it would have been different. But for me and for much of the population, I think what I've described wasn't uncharacteristic. For my German friends and their friends, people that I got to know in Germany from the 1970s onwards, I think it was quite different. And I think they came from from a Europe that had been like the phoenix from the ashes, had grown out of the war, and the entire ethos of the new Europe was to overcome the nationalism and the racism which had wrecked Europe and almost destroyed it completely in the period between, including the two world wars. And the way to that was actually through the European cooperation, and initially that was economic cooperation, which then had very rapid benefits in the 50s and 60s, and increasingly then through the sense of integration, meaning close cooperation, friendship, and increasingly integration in all sorts of different ways between the different countries of Europe. And I think that was something that was fairly typical for them, anyway, for the German middle classes. I mean, I'm generalizing wildly, but I think that probably was a fairly typical response at that time in Germany, as in West Germany, I'm talking about, not East Germany, West Germany. Down to the Maastricht Conference and the treaty that followed it and the incorporation of that from 1993 onwards, down to then, Europe was essentially an economic, it was a common market. And it's interesting that in Britain, long after we joined the European Economic Community, nobody really called it, maybe in official circles, but nobody in normal parlance called it the EEC. They always called it the common market. After 1992, after Maastricht, Europe then changed. It was already changing, in fact, in the years preceding Maastricht, with Jacques Delors was the president of the Commission and wanted to turn Europe into a much more political entity. And that's when Europe then started to alter significantly in the eyes of many people in Britain, because then Margaret Thatcher, who was the Prime Minister at the time, then famously said to these initiatives, no, 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 you see, we're not going down that route. And in her Bruges speech in 1988, she'd said we didn't fight back the inroads of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed from Europe. So then the major change was that this notion then started to catch hold inside the Conservative Party in particular of a move towards a federal Europe, towards a United States of Europe, where British sovereignty would be diluted and then lost in this new political entity. That was the big change that came about at that time. The second major change which came about was in 2000, after 2004, after the opening to the eastern countries, the former Soviet bloc countries, when Europe then, for us in this country, became a matter of increasing numbers of people coming from the EU, mainly from Poland at the time, into Britain, and that this flow of migration from the EU could not be stopped without leaving the EU altogether. So that was another change that gradually took over then in these crisis years, especially after 2008, where then the EU became increasingly synonymous with migratory trends that we couldn't control. So in those ways there were differences in this country. Germany, it's hard for me to speak in any general sense about Germany because I don't live there and don't experience it in the same way. But what I would think is that the idealism that existed initially in the post-war generation had become diluted, and that for Germany too, the EU was something which in their case actually worked, it functioned, and they were the beneficiaries of it. And to that extent, Germany wanted to hold on to the EU in its present guise, despite the fact that in many other countries then there were already trends developing, populist nationalist trends which were rejecting parts of the EU and so on. So I think the EU became a more abstract entity which didn't have the purpose of saving the peace because the peace had been saved and was now taken for granted. And instead the EU was much more of a distant organisation, institution that worked because it was worked in Germany's interest and to Germany's benefit. I think it's less a matter of constructing a new narrative for Europe and saying this is the way it should go. I think it's more a matter of the way in which it will go, determined by events which we can't foresee very easily, but where changes will take place and they will themselves reshape the narrative. And the whole history of the European Union and its predecessor, the European Economic Community, was really one in which it moved in accordance with mini crises or sometimes major crises, which would then push it towards new positions, which then brought about a new adaptation of interpretation or narrative. And I think that's likely to happen in the future, that we can do our very best to emphasise the values which have brought such benefits to Europe. I don't think themselves that they are likely to change the direction in which the European Union is moving at the present time. It's more likely that there will be some event or set of events which will then buffet the European Union and compel it to move, and it will then develop new narratives arising from that.